Well, hello, Needed Ministry leaders. At our district conference a few weeks ago, we heard from Jimmy and Susie Callum as they shared from Psalm chapter 80. And the frequent refrain of Psalm 80 is, "Restore us, O Lord. Let your face shine on us, that we may be saved." These words were prayed by Israel during a time of national decline. The exile was just about upon them, and enemy armies are invading. They see their strength fading. The peace of the land is ebbing away. Their holiness is in decline, and they are crying out to God for his restoring work. Well, I certainly don't think that we're in the same dire situation as Israel found itself in that psalm. I think our nation has a similar kind of longing for restoration right now. During this season of coronavirus, we long for health and stability and normalcy to be restored to our life. During this season of political turmoil, what a difficult election cycle we just came through, we find ourselves longing for peace and for unity to be restored. And especially for those of us in the church, we see the rising secularism of our culture. And if you're like me, you long for a revitalization of faith in Jesus Christ. So we long for restoration. Of late, I've felt this longing acutely. And so I've been reading some books about renewal. The book I'm reading right now is titled Dynamics of Spiritual Life, an Evangelical Theology of Renewal by Richard Lovelace. Tim Keller was one of Lovelace's students in seminary, and he wrote the foreword for the newest edition of the book. And here's what Keller wrote in the foreword. He wrote, "We cannot start gospel movements, but we can prepare for and steward them well. And far from being mere oddities of the past, revivals are relevant and necessary in every culture and age." Lovelace goes on to say in the book, he presents a case for the fact that we see in cultures an ebb and a flow of spiritual life. There's just a normal cycle of renewal. This is how God works. Therefore, we shouldn't be overly alarmed by this pattern wherever we find ourselves in the cycle. But we must do all that we can to prepare for what God will do, for only He can bring spiritual renewal. Now, right now, many within the church in America see the decline of faith in our culture and lament. And on one hand, that's very right. We should lament the ebb we see in spiritual life. Many long for the good old days when more people attended church, more people professed faith publicly in Jesus Christ. Yet renewal does not begin just by looking at what needs to happen in the culture around us for there to be renewal. If you look at history, renewal always begins within the church. We have to first see where renewal is needed inside the church. And Lovelace writes about that in his book. He writes, "Often the real enemy to be fought is not the visible oppressing powers, but the idolatry and apostasy by which the powers of darkness have reoccupied the hearts of God's people, as was the case with Gideon, whose most dangerous assignment was not to defeat the Amalekites, but to risk the anger of the Israelites by destroying his father's idol." It's not that there aren't things to oppose in our culture. There are. There are plenty of things. But the real problem is not the political policies of worldly rulers that are in opposition to God and his values. The real problem is the opposition to God within the hearts of God's people. The real problem lies in the church. So how can we prepare for the renewal that is needed inside the church? I want to offer you three things. First, I think we need to expect opposition. We need to expect there to be difficulty, both opposition from the culture, but also opposition within the church. Listen again to this quote from Lovelace. "Since the work of revival involves the displacement of the world, the flesh, and the devil, periods of renewal are times of great spiritual agitation in which troop movements on both sides are dimly visible in the background, As the sun shining on a swamp produces mist, the rising of the countenance of God among his people may result initially in disorders and confusion. The devil, who is losing ground as the revival progresses, fights back in a number of ways. His main strategies are those of accusation and infiltration. Don't be surprised if it doesn't go well in the church as you seek to stoke the fires of renewal. Opposition is part of it. Secondly, gain perspective and gain confidence from history. Immerse yourself in some of the renewals we see in Scripture. In the books of Judges, we tend to focus on the negatives of the cycle and miss the fact that God is constantly eager to bring his people back, that God is eager for renewal to happen. Look at the pattern we see in Scripture. Look at the pattern we see in church history again and again and again. On the heels of great cultural darkness, we see God bringing about revival, renewal. This is what God does. Gain confidence, gain perspective from history. And lastly, pray for renewal. Ask God to do this in the church. Ask God to make the hearts of his people soft to him, to his values, to make us repentant and eager to walk in his ways. There is no renewal, no revival in history that happens apart from there being a movement of prayer. Pray for God to do what only he can do. So join me in praying these words from Psalm 80. The words for revival. Restore us, O Lord. Let your face shine on us, that we may be saved. God's best to you. Have a great week.